fascinating day so far. I'm really honored to share the panel with all of these folks as well. I am going to present some extremely early stage work. Like, this is a project that is just a little tiny glimmer in my eye, but has been a glimmer in my eye for a long time. So we've seen a lot of really well-polished work with very carefully arrived upon conclusions and well-analyzed data. And this will not be that. Like, this is just very early stage work. But to me, this is the most fun stage of the process, and the reason I'm really excited to have the job that I have. So I appreciate all of you for being willing to listen to something that's very early. I am obsessed with rules. Alex earlier was saying he was obsessed with rules. Katerina's obsessed with rules. Who else here likes rules? We all love rules. Yeah. Yale Law School, where we love rules. I've been really interested in rules since I got my JD, and then since I got my PhD studying the sociology of law. When I initially started to think about rules as social systems, I got involved in a project that I just finished, a very long-standing project that was my doctoral dissertation, in which I just published as a book in December of last year, about digital enforcement of federal regulations that affect truck drivers. I will spare you the very long story about that project. Some folks in ISP had to hear a much longer version of it yesterday. But I started out thinking about rules when I started working on that project. There were a set of federal regulations about the time that truckers drive each day that were not being well enforced. And I was very interested in what happens when we start to take that set of rules and implement them digitally, enforce them digitally. And that was kind of how I started the project. Over time, it became kind of a different story about political economy and management and labor and kind of the cultural responses to surveillance, lots of other things. But I kind of felt like I never really got back to where I started with it, which is, how is it that digital enforcement helps us understand what rules even are to begin with? And so now I am trying to return to that kind of core question, which has been like a little itch in my brain since I started thinking about these things. And I am putting myself in progressively more painful situations in order to force myself to think about these things publicly. This is the first public outing for this stuff. I think probably many of us do this, where we sign ourselves up for workshops and conferences, and then are both happy and sad when we get in, because it means we're going to have to force ourselves to put pen to paper on these things. But that's what I'm doing today. My kind of core question, or place where I'm starting this project, is, do rules mean what we think they mean? Obviously, that's a question we can interpret on many levels. Lawyers all the time think about what rules mean in terms of how to interpret them. But this is, I think, a deeper question I'm trying to answer about what rules are supposed to do in society. Legal thinkers have for a very long time thought about the nature of rules, folks in other disciplines as well. Lorraine Daston's work came up earlier today. People in law have thought about rules versus standards, have thought about perfect enforcement of rules, right? This is something that legal thinkers and social thinkers have returned to many times. I would posit that AI and autonomous systems kind of force us to confront these questions anew, and that AI governance questions are lagging in the way that they tend to consider rules in a fairly thin way that's not particularly socially informed. And there are two dynamics I'm most interested in. One is the exploitation of loopholes, and the other is routine human rule breaking. And I'm going to talk through both of those in, my screen is different than this, so it takes me a second here. So I want to talk through both of those. One distinction I want to suggest might be helpful to help us kind of categorize these two things has to do with the distinction between the letter and the spirit of the law. This is a pretty familiar distinction to folks who have thought about legal theory. But, put very simply, I'm certainly oversimplifying a lot of nuance here, but the letter of the law we could think of as sort of the more formal or explicit manifestation of what a rule is, maybe something you would write down, like the speed limit is 55 miles an hour. Whereas the spirit of the law, of course, is much fuzzier, more difficult to pin down, can encompass policy goals, can encompass meaning or values that are sort of underlie the promulgation of the rule to begin with. Some of that has to do with social acceptability, right? What is it that we learn about what the spirit of the rule might be based on what rules we choose to enforce and how we choose to enforce them? And I want to suggest, and I'm just playing with this, so I'm like 75% convinced that this is right, but that's a big 25% that I'm not so sure. I'm playing with the idea that we could think of routine rule breaking and exploitation of loopholes as misaligned quadrants in a 2x2 matrix, where if someone is following the letter of the law but not the spirit of the law, we might think of that as exploitation of a loophole. Whereas if someone is engaging in routine rule breaking, and I'll give examples to sort of concretize what I mean by these things in a minute, that someone who's engaging in routine rule breaking is not following the letter of the law, but is following the spirit of the law. So let me talk through some examples of where I think we see these things in everyday life. Okay, has anyone seen the movie Air Bud? Yep. Thanks, Abby. A lot of folks have seen Air Bud, 1997. It's a really good film, family sports film about a dog that plays basketball. And there's much I could tell you about this movie. I actually think it's a really good movie. But one of the kind of the core conceits of the movie is that there's this dog, and the dog, it turns out, is really good at basketball, and the dog's owner, it's like questionable whether he's the dog's owner, but this kid who's taking care of the dog plays for this like sort of down on its like basketball team, and they want the dog to play on the basketball team. And there's this very famous scene, right, where the ref looks in the rule book and says, there ain't no rule that says a dog can't play basketball. And so hence Air Buddy, the dog, is allowed to play basketball and leads the team to the championship. Now, this principle comes up in a lot of sports movies, actually, that if something isn't in the letter of the law, right, isn't in the rule book, then it's okay, right? And therefore, like, it obviously has comedic value in a film like this, but it does seem to sort of violate the spirit of the rule, where we would think that most sports are really about fostering competition among human beings, human children in this case. But I think that's a good example of where maybe the letter of the law is violated, but the letter of the law is followed, but the spirit of the law is not followed. Children are really, really good exploiters of loopholes. I have 2 kids. If they're in the backseat of my car, they love, I'm sure many of you have either have children or have been children and have witnessed this behavior or engaged in it, where I say, don't touch your brother, Devin. His name isn't Devin, but I'm just going to use you as an example. Don't touch Devin. And so my daughter will just like put her hand right here, right? Like, not touching Devin. And like, obviously that's not what I meant. I'm like, just keep your hands to yourself. But it's not touching, can't get mad, exploits the loophole because I'm not touching him, but I'm still annoying him and me. There's some really interesting cognitive, oh my gosh, I only have 5 more minutes. I'm going to skip this. I'll just say only that like folks who work on the cognition of children actually talk about this behavior as being a really important way that children sort of come to understand goal conflict. So my goal, if I'm a kid, is to like do what I want to do, right? Annoy my brother. My mother's goal, if she's telling me not to do it, is to prevent that from happening. And so a way that kids kind of split the difference is through the exploitation of loopholes. This comes up in, oh wait, I'm pressing the wrong button. This comes up in labor context as well. There's some really interesting stuff that I won't have time to get into about work to rule labor actions, which is this idea that employees basically follow all the rules in the rule book to the letter as a means of resistance against an employer to cause a work slowdown. There's a wonderful example that I wish I had time to talk about with Marshawn Lynch, who's a running back for the Seattle Seahawks, who very famously engaged in this sort of a very similar kind of action where he would go to press conferences and he would just say in response to all questions, I'm just here so I don't get fined, which was because the NFL like wanted him to go to all these conferences, fined him for not going to these conferences. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to answer press questions. And so by merely responding with the same one line to every question, he was like cutting the difference, right? He was splitting the difference. I don't have time to get into this, but loopholes probably in the law, the place we encounter those the most readily is in the tax context. There's much we could say about the morality of tax evasion versus tax avoidance. Forum shopping, I think, is another really good example, where intuitively we have some priors about what types of forum shopping are maybe normatively appropriate, what are kind of a component of zealous advocacy, and what seems to cross the line for us into something that is nefarious or is inappropriate. Okay, so the tech part of this, AI, I think, is actually a great exploiter of loopholes. A lot of people have written about this in technical contexts. In contexts like what is sometimes called reward hacking or specification gaming, where the AI is given kind of some specification of a task, and the AI is very good at finding loopholes between what is maybe intended, the spirit of the law, and the task that's actually specified, right? The letter of the law. There's lots of examples I won't have time to go through about how like the AI, rather than like, or a robot will like not walk across a field, but will fall or something, right? If the goal is to get from A to B, that's obviously not what was intended, but that's what they'll do because that's a loophole in the way the task was specified. Sometimes we think that's really creative and elegant, and there are times in which that can lead to forms of discovery or creativity that we really value. And then there are other times where it's less desirable. Okay, very quickly. What's the other misaligned quadrant? I'll go through this more quickly. I think routine rule breaking, the paradigmatic example is traffic, right? So I mentioned earlier the idea of the speed limit. Almost none of us would think that driving 56 and a 55 really counts as violating traffic law. That's a routine violation of the letter of the law, most of us think the spirit of the law is not that you can't drive 56 and a 55. So much so that if somebody is pulled over for doing that, we think that's a sign of a pretextual stop. There's a bunch of really interesting examples from sports that I also will just skip for the sake of time around intentional fouls. I'm just returning to Air Bud. There's like a great XKCD about Air Bud, and the idea that eating the dog would be an intentional foul that may or may not be worthwhile. But, you know, in sports, right, if you foul someone, there's a school of thought in the philosophy of sports that says that's cheating, right? You're supposed to follow all the rules. And then there's another school of thought, probably the dominant school of thought, that says, no, breaking the rules is kind of part of the spirit of the game. It's strategic. Deciding when to foul somebody, like, is part of the skill that we want to foster in the sport, right? And I think that's getting at this distinction. Resume or profile padding, not at all what George Santos did, but I think he's like the face of resume padding at this point, but more routine resume padding, right? Like talking about proficiencies or skills you might have, you know, it's kind of inflating your role on a team, things like that. Same thing on dating profiles. There's a lot of good empirical evidence that people will routinely kind of inflate their height or decrease their weight or something on a profile. Those are the types of kind of routine puffery in which people readily engage. So that, you know, is arguably not violating what we might think of as the spirit of the law about kind of truthfully putting yourself forward, but people are certainly, you know, being untruthful in those contexts. Okay, what issues does routine rule breaking raise for AI governance? I think we can put it into two buckets. One of them is really well exemplified by the situation that arose with Tesla last year. Tesla had the self-driving, part of their self-driving beta had a mode that you could choose called assertive mode. And in assertive mode, among other things, the Tesla would roll through stop signs under certain conditions, right? It wouldn't come to a full stop at a stop sign. Something that people do all the time, right? Constantly people are doing this. But NHTSA, the federal regulator responsible for regulating autonomous vehicles, like pushed Tesla to recall this, right? Said like, you can't do this, this is breaking the law. Now this is breaking the law again in a way that humans routinely do. But NHTSA really pushed back because here it was an autonomous system breaking the law. And so we might ask, what's the meaningful difference between an AV that does that in assertive mode that's selected by a human and me setting my cruise control to drive 56 and a 55, which is something that happens all the time and which we certainly don't expect the technology to prevent that from happening, especially because if we start to get mixed traffic where you have autonomous vehicles and human drivers, there's good evidence that actually safety outcomes are worse if you have different speed limits or different traffic rules for different sets of drivers. Last thing I'll say just very quickly, I think we'll also run into interesting issues for AI governance when AI is the governor. So if we use autonomous systems to discipline human rule breakers, we might ask how they're going to deal with routine rule breaking, right? If everybody is speeding, for example, should the ticket camera ticket you for going 56 and a 55 or not? Most ticket camera systems don't do that. Most of them give you some kind of buffer that's like 10 or 11 miles per hour over the limit, partly because of accuracy concerns, but perhaps also because of this concern, right, that maybe we actually, you know, a human being is not going to ticket you for doing that. So maybe an autonomous system shouldn't either. We also then have interesting questions, I see you, about at what point you have to create a boundary, right? Is it more fair to have an implicit standard that says like, well, when we say 56, we actually, or when we say 55, we actually mean 66. You know, there are questions about the fairness of a boundary that you have to kind of have social knowledge to be aware of. So that was a very quick tour through some like undeveloped folds of my brain about this new project. I would love to hear examples, pointers to papers or other work I don't know about these topics, or also critiques of just whether this 2x2 is actually useful or accurate in giving us purchase over these questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. The next talk is by Anjali Anwar from the University of Michigan, and it's titled Seeing Like a Gig Company, Algorithmic Classification and the Re-Evaluation of Labor.
Hi, shall I get started? Sorry, I'm just waiting to see if my slides are there.
Yes, is the answer. Yes, we have your slides actually on the computer.
Oh, great. Okay,
Right.
thank you so much.
Great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Ira. I'm a second-year PhD student at the School of Information. And today I'll be presenting on my ongoing research, which is titled Seeing Like a Gig Company. So my work basically examines the business logics and algorithmic operations around labor management and the on-demand gig economy in India through a case study of Urban Company. I've been doing longitudinal research on the company for the past 4 years, predominantly ethnographic work, and most recently it includes discourse and critical discourse and content analysis on the company's public communications that have been ramped up a lot since rising gig worker protests in India. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, next slide. Thank you. So what is Urban Company quickly? It's officially registered as a technology company. It's the fastest growing on-demand home service platform in Asia. And home service platforms are basically like the Uber for home services. So anything that, any services like beauty and salon work that you can see on the slide, as well as like cleaning and home repair stuff can be ordered through the on-demand home service platform. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Okay. Next slide. So what is the problem context that I'm studying? So this study in particular kind of started in 2021 with the onset of the pandemic. India witnessed a series of gig workers unrest, which arose across cities from ride-hailing workers to food delivery workers. And finally, in 2021, we also saw the first home service gig worker protest by women beauticians who engaged with Urban Company. Next slide. In particular, the women beauty gig workers are protesting exploitative and disciplinary algorithmic control practices, such as the high and dynamic commission rates that the platform charged workers for using its algorithmic matching services and getting customers, as well as other algorithmic management functions, such as algorithmic blocking and the rating that is, I guess, most widely known. What was interesting and unique in this particular context was how Urban Company responded to the protest and rising public criticism. Now, in keeping with dominant corporate gig economy practices, the company also classifies its workforce as independent and thus enacts a legal disentanglement with them. But instead of emphasizing this legal distance, which is what most gig companies do in the face of criticism, etc., what Urban Company did was it emphasized their mission of empowerment, in particular, their investment in the social security measures of gig workers. Now, between these two claims of the company, this legal disentanglement versus like claims of investment in social security, there is a stiff tension, and that's what I'm going to be discussing today. Yeah, next slide. So there's a tension in existing gig scholarship that I find to be very relevant in comparison to from the Western context and the Indian context. Now, the bulk of gig scholarship, which emanates from Western geography, where formal, stable employment has been the norm, treats this coupling of employment misclassification, where gig workers are classified as independent or entrepreneurial, along with algorithmic control, as an indication of how companies completely disinvest from their gig workforce. However, in the Indian context, where informality has been the norm, there is a slightly tangential narrative which has been talking about how emanating not just from industry, but also from the state, about how the gig economy is what's going to bring the labor market into the formal scene and extend, more stable working conditions for an historically precarious workforce. What is interesting is that even with like companies like Uber, Ola, etc., there has been variable levels of investment, and not obviously in a sense of actually empowering workers, but a necessary sort of investment that kind of centralizes and otherwise really like fragmented informal workforce, also professionalizes them, and also extends the capital that is necessary for workers to actually participate in the sharing economy. Because to be able to drive for Uber, I need a car. And precarity, the historical precarity and informality in India is such that a huge section of the working classes don't have access to that kind of capital at all. Thank you. Next slide. So it is in this context that I use Foucault and Healy's classification situation framework to analyze how Urban Company has organized what they are calling empowerment or social security benefits algorithmically in a way that produces a hierarchy of classifications, novel classifications of workers that is managed algorithmically. And what do I mean by classification situations in this context? Very simply put, I'm arguing that the algorithmic management of workers and their attachment of benefits through this algorithmic management ends up producing a series of novel classifications which are shifting and dynamic and are based on very obscured logics and data collection practices enacted by the company. Yes, next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so before I get into the findings, this is a representation of how the company represents its gig workers on its website and other communication channels. As you can see, so this is a gig worker called Shalini based in Chennai, and the storyline that they use and kind of like position across their narratives as basically that, you know, struggling workers join the gig economy. They've been precariously employed. They haven't had access to any sort of benefits beforehand, but it's after coming to Urban Company that they access socioeconomic mobility as well as respectability and other forms of, you know, empowerment. As you can see, Shalini is kind of like, even though positioned as an independent worker through the framing of being an equal partner, presumably equal to the company, as well as, you know, other, the narratives also have a very gendered aspect where like accessing gig work has given her equality with her husband as well. But as you can see in the photo, there is she's wearing a uniform that is a company uniform. She's also holding a skill certificate that the company has given her after mandatory skill training that all workers have to go through before joining Urban Company. Yes, next slide. Okay, so what does Urban Company's promise of empowerment actually entail? If I'm arguing that in contrast to much of the Western scholarship on gig platforms, which treats claims of like, you know, investment and empowerment as completely false, I'm saying that no, it's not false, but it's very insidiously organized and algorithmically organized. I want to first like just highlight what is this promise of empowerment actually made up of. So as you can see on the slide, they have two buckets. That's how they characterize it. One bucket is called partner earnings. And the claim here is that workers access much higher earnings compared to offline working opportunities, irrespective of the kind of employment classification they're engaged with. So you can be like a, you know, a daily wage from being a daily wage worker, but also like a offline entrepreneur. Their argument is that the kind of precarity that exists in the Indian labor market is such that any kind of offline employment context is worse off than the gig context. The second bucket and the more interesting bucket here is the partner livelihood bucket, which includes a host of benefits from insurance to access to loans, as well as like skilling, etc. So this is what they frame as social security. Yes, next slide. So my analysis basically highlights how the company's promise of empowerment is in fact actually constituted by a rebranding and diluting of traditional employment benefits, which are associated with formal full-time salaried jobs, which the bulk of Indian working class, which is over 90% of the Indian labor market, have never had access to. So if this is what my analysis shows, I guess the question that we come to here is like, what is the problem, right? Like, even if this is a dilution of traditional employment benefits, why are women gig workers protesting? Why are gig workers protesting across the country if they're getting access to benefits and high earnings that they've never had before? And that's what I'm trying to show out here, that it's not just the dilution, but it's the particular organization of these benefits that is organized algorithmically and conditioned algorithmically that creates a new kind of novel precarity and a new kind of novel kind of labor valuation in the gig economy. And that is what the workers' protest is trying to highlight. Yeah, next slide. So here is a profile. So to explain the kind of algorithmic classification and conditioning that I'm talking about, this is a snapshot of how the worker's profile is represented on the customer app when you book a service. So as you can see on top, you have two sections. When you encounter the worker's profile, you see their rating and you see the total number of jobs that they've completed. And again, at the bottom, you see in bold the rating along with the stars that they have, right? So I'm framing these algorithmic evaluation and control practices of ratings, calculating the total number of bookings, etc., as different classification situations, as the ways in which the company is classifying workers. So this worker is classified as a 4.75 worker, which is like a high rating. So it's considered like, a good ideal gig subject in some sense. Yeah, next slide. So what are the implications of classification situations, particularly in relation to the kind of benefit system that urban company has? Okay, I have 1 minute. I'm going to try and race through this. While as everyone, I'm guessing, has a sense of what the algorithmic rating represents, it's supposed to be like an aggregation of all the customer ratings that a worker receives in their engagement with the platform. But what urban companies' website revealed is that their algorithmic rating logic is based on the most recent rating orders. So it doesn't actually aggregate all the ratings that customers have given across the workers' engagement with the platform, but only the ratings that the customers received in the last month or so, which basically means that these ratings are extremely skewed and don't and also kind of misrepresent the workers' performance in relation, which is anyway, customer ratings are subjective and based on a lot of bias, and there's a lot of literature on that as well. But the logic of how urban company has organized their customer rating also kind of reveals how obscured and skewed these kind of algorithmic evaluation metrics are. As you can see on the slide, the algorithmic rating is really important because not only does it determine workers' access to getting more jobs and getting better paid jobs, it also determines workers' access to personal loans. Now, the company tries to say that they extend loans to all and every worker, but like a closer analysis reveals that you have to maintain a 4.8 rating to access personal loans. Basically, and if the rating is only a calculation of your most recent orders, that means one low rating can completely skew my average, and it can prevent me from accessing the personal loan. And again, the second part being that the emphasis on the maintenance of a high rating, which means that it's unclear to me as a worker, if I have a high rating today, but that goes away day after, will I lose this access in a day? So there are all these implications that come up with this kind of algorithmic conditioning. And that's why I'm arguing that this produces a new kind of valuation metric and a novel kind of precarity, which is different from the historical and structural precarity that workers in the global South have experienced. Thank you so much. Sorry, lots more slides, but no time for that.
Thank you. And the next talk is by Devin Kennedy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The talk is titled Factory Work and Database Management, Industrial Origins of the Computer Database, 1958 to 67. But ethicists, like Tim Jibru, for example, they're arguing against that because the fear is that companies are going to blame this autonomous agent for the problems of the system of its deployment and not the companies themselves. Do you think this conversation could be detrimental for any potential regulation or ways of holding companies accountable for what their systems do? Or do you think that is actually a conversation, like many, including those who signed the letter a few days ago, calling for the stop of training new systems, is actually something that we should be caring about, specifically in the case that you were discussing? And then I'll ask similar questions, around ideas and ideology to all the panelists.
So I go now.
Yes.
I get a lot of time to think about it, did I? No, I'm joking. No, it's a great question. It's obviously very timely, right? These questions about how ideologies and accountability will be reflected in governance of AI systems. I haven't read that letter. I know that there is this letter kind of debating what, or implicitly debating what our priorities ought to be in thinking about governance of AI systems, and how we balance that with innovation and development. I think my interest in that is in having a thick rather than a thin notion of what governance is, which is just a way of kind of slithering back to this question of what rules do, right? So it's very nice to say we should have rules that govern what these systems do. But as I've tried to problematize a little bit, like what rules even are and how they function is a socially embedded construct, and one with like very different, that can kind of shake out or cash out in different normative ways that aren't entirely clear from the outset. So I think it does certainly complicate questions around alignment. I mean, Cooper, I think, said earlier today something about like not knowing what alignment is. Cooper doesn't know what alignment is. I definitely don't know what alignment is. But I think some of those questions around specification and alignment are certainly implicated by the project I'm doing, but that's probably as much as I can say about it right now.
Thank you. My next question is for Ira. I love to research. I do as well. Someone who does research on the gig economy, I not impressed by many of the findings because it's something we see in every single instance where platforms, or a single instance of the platformization of labor. One thing, however, that caught my attention was that urban company is reinventing welfare, basically. And this is a constant that we see with many technology companies that reinvent something by destroying it and then bringing it up again as something new and revolutionary. Let's think about public transit, for example, and so on. Now, you mentioned how this company is promising higher earnings, but also high livelihood, basically reinventing welfare. Can you talk a bit about how the workers that you encounter are taking that the reinvention of welfare, especially in India, in the Indian context? Like, what do you think about this? Platforms promising welfare, which traditionally should be or has been the purview of the government. So how do workers treat that in the cases that you studied?
That's an excellent question, and thank you so much, because that was my concluding slides, which I didn't get to. So this is a great way to get there. And I apologize, I'm having some computer trouble, so I'm sitting outside. So if there's any traffic noise that you hear, that's on me. So I think in the Indian context, it's really interesting because, like I mentioned, informality has always been the norm. But at the same time, as you're saying, there's a strong, like, rights-based welfare state historically. And there's a really strong sensibility of, like, worker movement and pride as well, right? Like the status of worker itself is a very prized status that has historically existed with like strong union movements, farmer movements, etc. So I think it's also important to kind of locate the gig workers' protests in that context, because I think from the neoliberal perspective, the idea is that, oh, you have this disenfranchised workforce, which is now getting some sort of formal benefit, even if it's not in the historical, like state citizen right context, but it's happening one way or the other. So this is seen as empowerment, etc. And it's a very like World Bank, IMF kind of driven narrative. So you have that on the other hand. And I think that's what is really interesting with urban company workers is that they're not denying the fact that their earnings may have increased, but I think the resistance points towards precisely what you're saying, the shift in our understanding of not just welfare, but rights, right? Like employment and traditional full-time employment, the status of being a worker, the status of being an employee is associated with like particular rights. And it's not, even if I'm a mediocre employee for all of like, this month, I have a right to paid leave. That's a right that's protected by labor law. But this shift, this conditioning, this algorithmic conditioning, and I really enjoyed the talk on like industrial datafication practices as well, because it kind of shows that it is a shift in labor management that's been happening for a while. And it's this particular like individualization of productivity evaluation, but not even just productivity. It's any and all kind of behavioral data that the algorithm manages to capture. So for instance, Urban Company also takes into account how fast a worker accepts a new job. And that is a metric that then feeds into how the worker can access welfare, which is insane to me. But yeah, so I think that the critical shift that's coming and the ideological shift that's coming with this like very neoliberalized version of empowerment and welfare is this shift from like citizen with rights to, you know, the gig entrepreneur who must constantly prove their worth, prove their value on very, like the irony is that they're very obscured metrics of valuation, but they must constantly on a daily basis prove that they are deserving of welfare that has historically been a right of every single citizen. And again, I think it's important to kind of put it in the context of the larger political situation in India, where citizenship rights in general are under threat as well. And employment rights with the new regime that's come into power are also under threat. So we have new labor codes that are completely diluting the power of unions, of organized labor, as well as like industrial labor laws that have protected us historically. And I think like to get back to your question, I think that's exactly what the workers are reacting to and protesting against, is this imagination that just because we have been economically disenfranchised in certain ways doesn't mean that this version of empowerment is okay.
Thank you very much. Now, my next question is for Devin. So Devin, I've heard some authors that talk about the history of the internet as one that turns from the non-for-profit, the more like scientific collaboration, think of the times of ARPANET and so on, towards more a privatized internet ruled by oligopolies. So this idea that we shifted from more group-oriented or collective internet, not owned by anyone, actually government-funded, towards a more private and internet, oligopolized internet. But then I heard your talk and how you actually say, no, actually, there is a corporate origin of many things, especially when we think about computing. So can you talk a bit more about this contrast between computing from its corporate origins, but then at the same time, how some historians portray the internet as this shift from non-for-profit to the profit version?
Thank you. It's a fascinating question. I mean, I guess I would say at a macro scale, the historiography of computer developments, including the internet, has emphasized, in the United States, has emphasized a military-industrial dynamic. And I guess my argument, one of the arguments in the book historiographically, is that we've sort of overemphasized the one directionality of that narrative, that it's a kind of military civilian outflow into the commercial space where it's captured by capitalist enterprises who are then able to take advantage of it. And I guess I have kind of two arguments. One is that much of this science is developing within industry in order to solve problems about the organization of capital and the management of labor in a specific period. And there's all these interesting dynamics where basically defense-funded researchers are have this sort of revolving door with companies like General Electric, where they're seeding these kind of developments that I'm describing. Then they're returning to places like the Rand Corporation. So they're moving back and forth between these places. Labor unions are an interesting place to study because in the late 50s and early 60s, they're pretty keyed in on the way that corporations have sort of expropriated state-funded technologies in ways that are now damaging labor, among others. So there's like a great issue of the kind of official magazine of the IUE, the union I was talking about today, that says in a big headline, built with the people's money, now is crushing labor power or something. So, in the sort of discourse about automation, and David Noble has talked about this a lot in the 80s, unions are quite aware of the way that the kind of the interconnectedness of the military and large industry is facilitating large industry's capture of state-funded technology. So I think like what I'm trying to do is emphasize a kind of earlier capitalist character to many of these technologies, because I think the politics of the military industrial narrative of computer development was important in a specific moment, but now in a period where most of our pressing concerns about governance are also about the governance of private enterprise, you know, we sort of need to look back at these stories of commercial interests and their shaping influence.
Thank you. And my final question for Jordan, by the way, great project and good luck with your field work. So we were talking about our research before, mine is focusing on Venezuela, where many workers actually also turn to Axie Infinity and other crypto gaming platforms. And one of the findings of my research in Venezuela was, in my case, I focus on Venezuela because it's the #1 country in the pandemic where data production was outsourced to. I found that it was for 3 reasons. First one is the infrastructure that enables online work. People have access to computers, internet, and so on. The second one was the crisis that Venezuela is still experiencing, high levels of inflation, but there is an ideological reason as well, and it's a rejection from a lot of the workers of the collective, or let's say socialist policies of the government, and the feeling that they were left to their own, and therefore they had to become these entrepreneurs that Ira was talking about. So my question to you is, actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is, do you think there is where do you think are the reasons why the Philippines is where most of the workers for Axie Infinity are located? And the second question, especially when you were describing how they were framing these scholarship programs, why this educational framing for these schemes?
For sure. Yeah, so I think that, and I mentioned to you briefly as well, that I think that looking at both the Philippines and Venezuela would actually open up some comparisons that would make more sense of the situation, because while there are similar conditions going on in both places, I think that the reason that it took off in the Philippines may have been slightly different. I think that, for one, the game was actually based in, the game's makers are actually based in Vietnam. So Southeast Asia has a little bit of a different relationship to the game and how quickly it spread there. But I would still need to, I think that once I am able to conduct those interviews and actually learn more from the people who started playing it very early on, that would actually really help me understand why it cropped up in the Philippines in the way that it did. But yeah, I'm really interested to also look at the Venezuela case. And as for why the educational framing, I think this goes along with a lot of what Sky Mavis, a games developer, attempted to do throughout the white paper. There's a disclaimer on the very first page after they talk about all of these liberatory promises of, this is a pathway out of poverty. This is a great way for people to earn an income where they have no access to regular work. At the very bottom of the page, there's this massive disclaimer saying, this is a highly volatile space. Don't essentially overinvest. There's like a whole bunch of, this is not financial advice. So I think that with what Sky Mavis has done with the white paper to set up these disclaimers, but also tell people that this is a tool for onboarding people to Web3 and crypto more broadly, the underlying thread of education was there from the game's inception. And I also think it helps obscure from the fact that, once again, this is labor that people are engaging in. It's not just play. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll open the, yes, you have something to say. Oh, go ahead, yes.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, I guess I was wondering, when folks are talking about how the game is boring, do they also talk about the business model though? Because, you know, in the one criticism of a lot of these junk tokens, there's an idea that like everyone knows that it's a Ponzi scheme, and you just want to be you just don't want to be the last person in.
Yeah.
And so are the players thinking, okay, well, this isn't fun, but like I actually sort of believe in the business model here, so I think I can get rich before it collapses?
No, 100%. I think that it was actually in one of the slides that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but one of the things that our analysis revealed is that alongside of this being not play and earn, but play to earn, a lot of players and critics are in on the fact that early entrants are going to benefit. And the further and further you get from that, the more likely you are to be the one who doesn't profit. And players are okay with that. They talk about it as a Ponzi scheme. And a lot of the information on the subreddits, on Twitter is essentially, okay, I got, but I can keep playing until I recoup my losses at this point, you know? But yeah, people are very much aware of like what the situation is. Now, again, the reason why I'd want to do more interviews is because I'm kind of wondering how many of the people saying that are people who could have afforded to lose that money, and how many of those people are perhaps players in developing countries who borrowed hundreds up to $1,000 US to get started in a game that collapsed just months after they bought in, right?
Thank you. I open the floor for questions from the audience. Yes.
No, thank you so much. It was really amazing, very interesting. My name is, sorry.
I have a fear that your mic is not on.
Okay, better now. Cool. My name is Jamila. I'm a PhD student researcher at Paris University, and mainly my research on blockchain-based dispute resolution systems and governance of decentralized autonomous organizations. And it was incredibly interesting. Thank you so much, everyone, again. My question, I had one question to Jordan, just because I think some of the things that you said kind of overlaps with what I'm working on. What you described the project and essentially something that turned into, from what you described, I had this idea that it was kind of in the end some sort of like neo-colonialism when a certain group of people were ultimately forced to work and it wasn't so fun anymore at the end. Like recently, I've conducted with my colleagues study on a proof of humanity registry, where basically was like a first blockchain-based registry for humans. And one of the like solutions, one of the first plugin solutions for that was UBI concept, like universal basic income, where people would just generate tokens just for being registered on the registry. They didn't even have to do anything at all. And what we've observed, like they are still generating money. And similarly to what you presented in your presentation, people were drawn to get registered, not because they believed, this is my personal opinion, not because they believed in, you know, the greatness of the project, the business model, but more that they were drawn to that idea that they could generate some additional income. And in our case, there were like a lot of registrars from Argentina and from some regions where like people were economically struggling. So essentially, because of the crash of the market, many people stopped generating. They still do, but this is like the token price is so low. And at some points they were able, as you said in your example as well, people were able to purchase land. They were able to, you know, significantly improve their levels of income. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm sorry. First, you've talked about disclaimers, and like, I don't know, in my personal experience, disclaimers and white papers are nothing more than just like trying to limit liability, you know, in front of like regulators. It doesn't really mean anything. And many people would put like, our token is not a security, but even if it qualifies with all of the characteristics to the security. And then my question is like whether, first of all, the governance model, like you've said that there were this kind of, you had to purchase NFT in order to participate. And was it always like at this price, or it was just like, probably was depending, or like it was in Ethereum or some other cryptocurrency that changed through the market. And yeah, like whether all those transactions between the managers and the scholars were happening on chain or off chain, so how that was regulated by the community. And then I think one of the biggest questions is what were the expectations, because you said that you want to go to Philippines to talk to the people who use this game, and I really hope that you do get the funding and you do so. But I also am curious, what were the expectations of the game makers? Because as you've mentioned, they were saying that this is game play and earn, which essentially turned into play to earn. So yes, basically two questions: the governance model, and then these kind of expectations from the game makers that. Was it kind of like the project that went out of control? Because by what you've presented, it is highly controversial in the end. Was there anything beyond this, like onboarding people to crypto space, and how the game makers, seeing this whole situation? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I definitely encourage you to send me an email, or we can chat after this, because I think there's a lot of great conversations that we could have. A lot of the governance stuff, it's like really nitty gritty details. So maybe we can save for that conversation. But first thing I wanted to touch on was, yeah, a lot of people have made the claim that this is like a sort of neo-colonialism. I try to not make that argument, even though I'm very interested in how this is a reproduction of extractive geographies online. And I'm really interested in the imperial project that is ongoing. I still tend to steer away from the neo-colonial framing. Perhaps we could talk more about why offline, but and the disclaimers. I think that the disclaimers are really great because rather than serving as like a guardrail, I see it more of a dare to say, yeah, this is like, it's very much like the old Facebook motto of move fast and break things. Like it's okay if we lose some money, because like we're going to do well with this project. Now, in terms of how people join the game, it was mostly around purchasing NFTs. So you needed 3 Axie Infinity NFTs to join. When the game launched in 2018, you could field a team for less than $5 US. By the time that the game was at its peak, you were looking at $1,000 in total. And then today, there's actually been a big quality of life update, I guess you could call it, where you can get free starter Axie NFTs. They're kind of terrible. You can't really win games with them. And on top of that, the tokens are worth next to nothing. But yeah, so you can see that it went from under $5, 1,000, dropped very quickly after the crash in November 2021. And I think that the expectation from Sky Mavis, very much like the players, was that, okay, we're creating something here that's going to generate income for a short amount of time. We need it to be fun. We need it to be educational. We need it to onboard people to Web3. But based on how they designed the game, I don't think that like this is just my understanding. Like I don't know of how true this is, but I don't think that they expected this game to last all that long. They're still putting work in, but yeah.
Hi again. Thank you for the wonderful panel. I have first a very quick comment for Karen, because she asked for examples. Look at Gilbert and Sullivan. An awful lot of their apparatus turn on dealing with getting out of rules. I mean, I can think of about 10. Okay. So yeah, we can talk a little more later if you want. Devin, I wanted to ask you, it may be just simply a terminological confusion on my part, but I have both the advantage and disadvantage of living through a lot of the periods that are being talked about. And when I first heard of database management systems, they were being developed and used to keep data having to do with inventory or with patient records, and being marketed by companies like Oracle, which is still around today. They were not particularly for managing workers. So I'm wondering whether there's a connection, historically development of, they move from one kind of database management that you were talking about to other database management and the terms changed, or whether there's not a relationship here, or how you're seeing that in the work that you're looking at.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, maybe it's just a clarification I can provide. So, yeah, database management systems is a later coinage. The system I described early in my talk and then concluded with was primarily used to do things like inventory management. Later, they would call this kind of work enterprise resource ERP. I would say the argument I'm trying to make is that labor management was among the early uses of database management systems, but not its only use. And I'm using the term database management to connect management's interest in labor control and database management as a technical concept. So I'm using the term in both ways. Yeah, the specific system that I talked about is called the Integrated Data Store. It's a direct access database management system. Yeah, sorry.
So as I'm understanding, there is an overlap in that then the workers are treated the same way as the objects.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, and maybe I'm too subtle about that point. The idea, like the key development of these models in the 60s is a pervasive data object or a persistent data object that can be connected. It's not a relational database, but that can be networked with a bunch of other dependencies. And so, yes, the idea is that it's both parts, processes, and people who can be managed within a single system. And yes, this is the prehistory of systems like Oracle, which makes their coin on a relational database model beginning in the 80s.
So I adored all 4 papers, so thank you to all of you. I'm obsessed with rules. I have a thought for Karen, and I'm actually sort of hesitant to say this because I don't know whether my thought here is something that you're already completely familiar with and it's completely obvious to you, and why am I wasting your time with it, or whether I'm actually going to say something useful. But you mention rules and standards very briefly in passing in the paper and at the start of your presentation today. And I was struck by that because it seems to me that the distinction between rules and standards is in fact fundamental to the entire set of questions you're asking. Because for the benefit of everybody else in the room, suppose you've got a goal. You want to stop people from driving at unreasonable speeds. Well, there are different ways you can try and effectuate that. You can pass a law. It is illegal to drive at unreasonable speeds. We call it a standard. Or we pass a law that says it is illegal to drive more than 70 miles an hour, a rule, and there are various reasons why you might want to use either a rule or a standard. But why it's relevant here is because standards tend to eliminate all of the problems that you're talking about in the paper. So that if you're worried about things like rules gaming, the first thing you want to address is, well, do I want to approach this via a rule or a standard? And if AI technology forces us to rules, that's a significant aspect of the technology we're dealing about. So I guess that's not really a question, but I wanted to just put that on the table out there since it seemed important.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's so important. The reason I haven't made more of it in the paper is I'm not sure what to make of it yet, but I completely agree that there's a nice resonance between the rules versus standards debate and what I'm looking at here. One thing that struck me as really interesting is in beginning to delve into some of the technical literature on like specification gaming and reward hacking. Oftentimes it seems like the technical response to an exploit of a loophole is, well, is like the opposite of a standard, right? It's like, well, what we need is to specify better, right? Like, let's rule harder. And which is reasonable. Like I see why people do that. But that's very much the opposite of saying like what we should have is just a rule that says drive at a reasonable speed. And maybe the thinking, right, is like, well, you can't really tell an autonomous agent to do that because how are they supposed to know what's reasonable? So we have no choice but to turn towards rules. Yes, agreed.
The other thing you should be looking at, or another thing of the many things you should be looking at, is literature on smart contracts.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's very much the same set of concern. I agree.
So we do have one question on Zoom. Was Axie play/work a euphemism for data mining or purely Ponzi?
I think not data mining necessarily, but people have compared it to having the ability to mine cryptocurrency without having to have the hardware to do it. Because essentially, instead of running 6 GPUs in your parents' basement at a reduced rate for electricity, you have a mobile phone that you can play a game, battle your little Pokemon-like critters, and if you win, you get a few tokens. So not necessarily data mining, but yeah, crypto mining in a way. And Ponzi scheme, arguable. I'm hesitant to say yes entirely, just because I'm not that pessimistic, but I think there's a good case to be made.
And I should have said that was James who asked the question. So.
Hi, thank you for all your papers. I have a question for Karen and a question for Jordan. So the question for Karen, so the question that you seem to be asking, which I think is a really interesting one, which is if we tolerate routine rule breaking and we tolerate exploitation of loopholes by humans, would we also tolerate it if it was done by autonomous systems? And I don't know, like, when I try to answer that question, I can't. So I don't know if that's the question I want to answer or if I care more about the consequences. And what I mean by this is it worse to be killed in combat by a human soldier or by a autonomous drone, like a fully autonomous drone? And in the same vein, is it worse to be killed on a highway by a self-driving car as opposed to a human doing the exact same thing as a self-driving car, but it was a human rather than an autonomous vehicle? And I feel like there's something there, but I don't know how to articulate it. And it's something about like dignity and reciprocity and role reversibility. And I'm thinking here about Kyle Brennan Marquez's work on role reversibility. So I don't know if that's an element that you want to play with, or like, because I really struggle to articulate this because it feels like there's something different about it, but I don't want to just chalk it up to dignity because that's such a like contestable concept. So I'm wondering, and then I'll ask Jordan, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'll respond only like quite briefly. First to say, I love Kyle's work. I've gotten to write some with Kyle, and his work on reversibility certainly is informing a lot of the way I think about some of these questions. I do think there's something more than kind of a consequentialist or like dignitary concern here. I share that with you. I think, but I also kind of struggle to say what it is. I think I am thinking about rules in a fairly functionalist way, right? That like the reason we tell people we want them to ostensibly, like one view would be the reason we tell people to drive less than 65 miles an hour is because we've determined, this is, I know this isn't the way we actually make rules, is because we've determined that to be a threshold beyond which you can't safely drive, right? Or there's some functional reason we've established that as the threshold for certain types of rules for which we establish these thresholds, right? Which not all rules are like that. If that is the case, it's not obvious to me functionally, if there's a difference where we're like, actually an AV can travel at 70 miles an hour and functionally that's just as safe, that's a key, that seems like a key distinction. But to my knowledge, that's not the way the rules are being made at the time, right? Like currently. And if anything, I think some of the rules that say like, actually, it's unsafe to have some cars driving 5 miles an hour. Like there's a big conversation in trucking right now about this because trucks often have separate speed limits. And there's a bunch of studies that say actually like everybody should just have the same speed limit. So I think from a functional point of view, we might ask these questions about, you know, should we treat everyone the same because that's just the way society works best and most efficiently and most safely. But I agree with you completely that there are another important set of dignitary concerns about who's making decisions and like what the consequences are for people who are affected by those decisions, whether that's a human or machine.
Thank you. And my question for Jordan is, so the whole thing about like whether or not Axie Infinity is exploitative or empowering, I think is so interesting because of this tension between like getting property rights over your like Axie and what that means for your, you know, long-term economic status. What I'm really curious about is, so I guess one reading suggestion and one question. The literature on economization of play that you referred to feels a lot like the literature around play as labor that came up in the context of content ID. So the fact that like a lot of creators who create memes and parodies and other things online on platforms like YouTube, they might classify that as play. Some scholars classify that as labor because that content is monetized by content ID. And so the people who spend hours creating that content are not actually able to generate money off it because it's by default allocated to the right holder. So that literature feels very like in conversation with what you're talking about in terms of economization as play, but also thinking about like digital work online as labor. And then my question is, how do you see the economization of play in Axie Infinity like differently from professional sports? And I'm thinking about like athletes who are able to monetize, you could call it the labor of sport, through like monetizing their likeness if they're, you know, avatared for a video game, or monetizing their likeness in other ways, like, which is also sort of a property right depending on who you talk to. So how do you see this as different or similar to like how professional sports have always monetized their players?
Thanks. First, thanks for the literature recommendation. I'll definitely follow up to ask more. Now, in terms of the economization of play, we haven't really thought about it in the context of professional sports. We've more so been looking at the literature that focuses on professionalization of like esports or streaming, that sort of thing. And what we were looking at there is that while in esports or in streaming, a lot of the professionalization is around the exceptional player or the exceptional on-stream personality. In Axie Infinity, the professionalization is the average player. It doesn't matter what your skill level is. If you have the worst Axies or the best Axies, it's just about that one single person having the ability, just like anybody else, to go out there and earn an income from that. And that's what we thought was so different about professionalization in this aspect. And also, like, for instance, I talked about how traditional video games monetize by selling, whether it be licenses, subscriptions, battle passes, DLC. Sky Mavis doesn't do that with Axie Infinity. They don't really make they don't really generate profit from their sale of Axie NFTs. It's mostly from the price action on the game's cryptocurrency tokens, like they're called Smooth Love Potion and the AXS token. And so they benefit off of the price action on those, whether they go up or down. They can trade them as they see fit. So the monetization is very different from regular video games or traditional video games. The professionalization is also vastly different. And that was why we decided to go through with economization rather than either of those two other terms. Now, what you've said about like sports players using their likeness, things like that, also makes me think of like what was happening with a lot of the college athletes that wanted to make money, rightfully so. And yeah, I'm gonna have to sit with that and think about that more, because I love sports, and it never occurred to me to think about it in that way. So thank you so much.
So I would like to conclude this session and the first day of the conference. Thank you very much. And big thanks to the panelists for the presentations.